for coming today for our penultimate session in the STEM Teaching Essentials Workshop for the spring semester. My name is Corey Fada-Hartley. I'm from the College of Natural Science, and I help to organize these things with Kelly Millenbaugh from Ag and Natural Resources, Kendra Cherabello, who's in the kitchen, and Mark Urban-Lorraine, who's also in the kitchen, and Suzanne Lang as well. So we thank you for coming. I am very pleased to introduce our speakers today. There are two folks that I have worked closely with quite a bit myself, and I have stolen this idea and used it in both an introductory class and a 400 level class. So I think it's a really great way to engage large groups. So we have today Dr. John Stoltzfus and Dr. Terri McElhinny. John is the director for the biosci program here, which is responsible for delivering all of the introductory biology courses for natural science students and many people beyond that. So he also teaches in that program. Terri has taught both courses in the biosci program, and she is also the curriculum coordinator for our fundamental genetics course. So I'm going to turn it over to them.
All right, thank you.
Just as a note, a couple notes. Please remember to complete your evaluations and turn them in at the end. And if you're going to talk, we need to use the microphone, not for sound, but so that we catch it for the recording. So if you can just hold on to your comments until we get a microphone to you, that would be great.
All right, thank you, Corey. So just a little bit of context. So since we are biologists, the examples we're going to be using are biology, but I hope what you'll see is that the use of D2L could apply broadly across many different disciplines. So, and in fact, I would also put out there that there's lots of variations on what we're talking about and doing with D2L. So hopefully you can think creatively and say, you know, well, maybe this part will work and maybe that part won't. And so hopefully you can take something out of this that'll be useful for your teaching in large enrollment classes and maybe even in smaller classes as well. So just to start out with a little bit of literature. So rather than going back and citing the literature that I was actually reading 5 years ago when I started thinking about doing this, I'm going to give you some more current references. So Life Science Education, CB Life Science Education Journal just very recently put up this resource on group work. So rather than giving you a bunch of references about group work, I'd refer you to this resource, which actually has lots of references in it about group work. And so to use this to kind of situate where we are, so we are, that doesn't show up, let me see here. There we go, okay. So the last one, at the last STEM Essentials Workshop, how many people were at the last workshop? Okay, a few of you. So Tammy talked about using formal groups, and she had sort of a paper system set up with these formal groups, okay? So we are going to be using informal groups, and we're using D2L, but you can imagine doing some of the things we're talking about with formal groups as well. So there's lots of kind of mix and match things that could go on here. So I'll let you. So are these slides going to be posted? They'll have this. So you'll have this URL in the slides eventually. So the course that we're focusing on here, and once again, this just happens to be the context in which we did this, is BS 161. So the course description is macromolecular synthesis, energy metabolism, molecular aspects of development, molecular genetics. So it's basically an introductory cell and molecular biology course. It's taught fall, spring, summer, and there's over 2,000 students every semester that go through this course. It's required for all of the life science majors pretty much, and there's a smattering of other students, actually quite a few other students from other majors in there as well. Lots of students who want to be pre-med. In fact, if you ask the students, what do you want to do when you grow up, most of them will raise their hand and say that they want to go to medical school. There's also a good contingent of nursing students in there as well. So that's the context in which we were doing this. So in terms of section number, well, the number of students in each section, I'll talk about that a little bit here. So there were historically 2 sections of this course each semester that were very large, 500 students or so, oftentimes. And because of the biology initiative, we were able to bring the number of students per section down. So now the average is around 250 students per section. We also got some additional support from with TAs and ULAs that made this possible as well. And so part of the biology initiative was to change what we were doing in the classroom, and so that students would actually be thinking about not just let's memorize things for multiple choice tests, but actually thinking about disciplinary knowledge, thinking about how you use that knowledge as part of scientific discovery, generating new knowledge, as well as how you communicate what you're learning and what you're discovering. And so ideally, we would like to situate what the students are doing in class sort of at that junction between those things. They still need to be learning biology. There's a biology class, right? But hopefully they're learning that, they're using that knowledge in ways to think about things in the way scientists think about, and to be able to communicate what they're learning. And so we decided that using models would be a good way to try to merge these things together. And so once again, the modeling is the context in which we're doing this, but I hope you could envision using what we're doing in D2L for lots of different types of projects that you may want your students to do. The point is, in order to kind of merge all of these 3 things, you probably can't just do simple multiple choice tests, and you probably can't just stand up in front of the students and lecture to them for 50 or 80 minutes, because you actually want the students to be actively doing things. So in our context, we're thinking about models as a tentative public representation. And so some people think of models as mathematical, and so that is a public representation, a mathematical formula. In our case, in an intro cell and molecular class, we don't actually do a lot of mathematical models. We have sort of more diagrammatic process type models. But it's something that you can share with other people, right? It's a public representation, so you can share it with other people. So in our models, there's features or components, the parts of the model, the parts of the cell, the parts of the process. And in the model, you have to put those in there and label them so people know what they are. And then the goal of the model is to explain something. And we tend to think of cause and effect type things in our models in biology that are explaining this phenomena, this biological phenomena, or this system that we're looking at. And then scientific models generate predictions that you can test. And typically in the lecture class, we try to get the students to think about predictions, but we don't actually do the testing. And in some cases, we're bringing in evidence from the outside to try to get them to think about how the evidence supports the models. But so far in what we've done, we haven't done a lot of the supporting the models with evidence. It's a place where I think we can improve, perhaps, in our particular context. So this is the task that we're having the students try to do in class. And this is the basis then for needing this system that we developed in D2L to allow the students to share these models with each other, with us, so that we could evaluate them, and then that they can get feedback on these models. So just a little bit of literature. So 2 citations here, and once again, these are a little biology focused, since that tends to be the literature I look at. The idea that models can be a tool for making sense of novel phenomena or processes. As scientists, I think we all think about models or use models mentally to try to figure out what maybe the next step would be. For our in our research, well, for the students, these are processes. These are novel processes to the students. So we're trying to get the students to do the same type of thing, not just memorize a list of facts about this system, but actually to think about it and try to figure out how it works as they're learning this. And it also can be a tool for understanding the underlying mechanisms. Oftentimes, what we're observing, there's mechanisms underneath that we want the students to actually understand, and they're going to need to go down in scale. In biology, we think across scales. So if you're looking at something at the cellular level, there's probably things at the molecular level that you need to understand to explain what's going on at that larger scale. And so the models can be a tool for doing that as well. So there's just a couple references there about kind of why we decided to concentrate on models. So as part of backward design, let's see. Actually, we're going to let you go now, I think. Is that right?
Yes, that's true.
That's true. So Terry's going to talk to you a little bit about backward design.
We changed our numbers right before we started, so. So the focus of STEM Essentials this semester has been on backward design. And if you've been attending the workshops thus far, you've done some thinking about learning objectives in your classes, assessments that you might use to determine whether or not the students have obtained those learning objectives, and then thinking about classroom experiences that are aligned with the learning objectives and the assessments. So we're going to use this as sort of a map to walk you through the development of one of our modeling activities from learning objective to classroom implementation, and how we use D2L to support these active experiences in classroom settings of upwards of 300 students. So we start with our learning objectives. For BioSci 161, a group of faculty met to articulate learning objectives about 3 years ago now, 3 or 4. And we've highlighted 2 for you here. So we've got objective 1 is more of an experiential learning objective, more of a scientific practice learning objective, reasoning from evidence and using explanations, whether they be graphical or written. And then number 2 is more of a core concept, describing molecular structures and thinking about structure and function. And these are the 2 learning objectives that we'll focus on to illustrate our model for you. So this was our ultimate dream, to have an assessment where students were taking what they had learned about structure and function in biological molecules, this is a polypeptide example, and apply what they know to a novel situation and reason about it. So we have students looking at this example, which is a drug binding to an enzyme. So that's the illustration here. So this was given to them as part of the exam question. And we asked them to explain, given what they know about polypeptide structure, the role of a specific amino acid in this polypeptide in how the drug functions, how it interacts with the enzyme. Then further, we asked them to think about how they could modify the drug in order to change the interaction with this specific enzyme. And they had to articulate and predict the specific change. And then they needed to explain the difference between the 2, why the new drug would be more effective than the original one. So this is a pretty tall order for a 100-level class. And we knew that going in, but we wanted to make sure that our students were prepared for this type of activity on the assessment. We knew that we couldn't just give this to them and expect them to be able to do it based on their knowledge of structure and function. So we needed to wade them in through the baby pool. So we designed a classroom experience to get them ready for this type of reasoning and for this type of explanation. So they had been reading about structure and function in class. We've been doing mini lectures on structure and function. They had done some digital homework about structure and function, so they had the basic core concepts down. And then they came in for modeling exercise day. To prep for modeling exercise day, we had them read a popular press interpretation of a study about a drug for Ebola, and the study was done in mice. So they had all of that background walking into the classroom that day. And then we had them do several things. So we had them draw the interaction that was described in their paper, and then they needed to not only do that, but write a structure-function explanation of the described antibody-antigen interaction. So this was just making sure that they can articulate the information in 2 different ways, right? Draw us a picture of it, but also explain it to us using the vocabulary that we've been using in the class. Then we asked them to think about changing the interaction between the antibody and the antigen a little bit, and do that based on what they know about structure and function. of polypeptides. So they swapped out an amino acid here. They made a new drawing of the structure-function interaction with their new antibody here. And then again, we had them explain in sentences why the change in structure causes the change in function. And we spent a lot of time having them construct sentences with the word because and having, doing several sentences in a row. This happens because of this, then this happens because of this, so that we can really get a good idea of exactly what it is they're thinking about. And this prepared them pretty well for our assessment. We did this several times over the course of the semester. I think depending on the course, it was done 5 or 6 times with different modeling activities. And so when the students got to the midterm exams, they were prepared for this type of assessment, this type of questioning, and they tended to hit the ground running. So hopefully your wheels are already spinning and thinking about what you might be able to do in your classroom if all of the barriers that you currently have in the way were broken down, right? And specifically, we're here to talk about barriers in terms of large class size and getting students to do active learning and produce a product that is pretty in-depth, at least compared to what they had been doing in the class. So the question is, how do we do it? Let's talk about what you might be able to do in your class. We'd like to have you sit and think about a dream assessment that you might create for your class. If all of your barriers were broken down, what sort of assessment would you want to give your students? And you can do this based on other work you've been doing in these seminars if you've been coming over the course of this semester. If you have an assessment idea that's already linked to a learning objective, go ahead and start with that. Just sketch out a couple of things that you would like to have your students demonstrate to you to indicate that they have knowledge of the learning objectives for your class. Or if you just have a learning objective in mind, think about how you might assess that specific objective. And think outside the box, break down all the barriers, and we'll show you what we've done, and we'll talk in a little bit about exactly how to use D2L to leverage these types of assessments. So I think we've got about 5 minutes of work time, and we'll be back.
All right, so what we're going to do, so what we're going to do is bring everybody back together here. And so we'd like to do a little report out of the kinds of things that you came up with, as well as the barriers to doing those things. So what is it, if you could have your students do anything you wanted to on this dream assessment, what would you have them do, and what are some of the barriers to actually implementing this in your course? Right. So.
Oh, hold on, Rob.
Yeah, I wish we could have an oral exam component of a final where, not the whole thing, but one particular concept about molecular changes during phase diagrams and energy changes during phase changes, that every student would go through this oral exam gauntlet and you could really assess whether or not they truly understand
so
it.
Being able to sit down with a student and poke them and say, well, what about this, what about that, that would be essentially the ultimate assessment, right? Yeah. And so what's the barrier to doing that then? Okay, Captain Obvious,
18,000
right?
students in your class.
Exactly,
Yeah.
the number of students, right? Yeah.
Hold on, no.
So I have about 500 students in my class, and I would like to ask them, what's the explanation for your answer to that multiple choice question? Because I have them I now break them up in groups and we do a little bit of discussion, and they answer all these questions fine. Well, a lot of times. And then we ask them the explanation, and there's issues. Yeah, so, right.
So I have a lecture in a lab, and in the lab I kind of can do a little bit of my dream assessment because there's only 25 students there. So my idea for a good assessment is to have them practice what they learn actively and show you that they got a skill. So it could be at the end of each chapter, I would completely avoid exams, and it would be at the end of each section, chapter, or whatever main objective, have them do something and show proficiency in that. And then, it's kind of like a continuous learning environment too.
And so what's the barrier to doing that, do you
Well,
think?
I have 275 students in this hall next door with 3 LAs and me, so it really is, time is the main constraint, because how would you do that, in class?
Yep. And Adele, for you, what was the main barrier for you as,
Well, how to grade it.
yeah, how to grade it, yeah. Yeah. All right. All right, so, yeah, this is me. All right, so you've thought about your dream assessment, okay? And now if you think about what you do in the classroom, is what you're doing in the classroom now actually preparing students to do this dream assessment? What would you have to change about your instruction? Well, in our case, it certainly was not, because what we tended to do before this was stand up and tell the students stuff, right? And when you think about what the students were being asked to do on the exam, it wasn't just recall facts, they were now being asked to actually take these things, put them together, explain things that they'd never seen before, and me standing up and telling them things is probably not going to get them to the place where they can actually do those things we were going to ask them to do on the assessment. So we needed to think about what we were doing in the classroom and how we could change that. And so a number of the barriers that came up were time, right? So if you have the students work individually, then you have to have the students, you have to assess the students individually, right, in your classroom instruction. So if you ask them to do something in the classroom and you're going to give them feedback on it, if they're all doing it together, or if they're all doing it individually, now you have 500 individual things to look at, right? But if you start putting them in groups, you can start paring down the number of things you have to look at to give them feedback. So that's part of the rationale for putting them in groups. And there's lots of other value to having students in groups working together. Once again, there's references at the beginning of that. So, yes? Yeah.
Question though, when you put them in groups, often you hear from them that different people do different amounts and levels of the work.
Yeah.
So if you give the same grade to everybody in the group, then they have, okay, do you want me to, okay. I was saying, if you put them in groups, which I've done with different things, they'll tell you that not everybody does the same amount of work, even though you try to deal with that. And so then sometimes they resent that they did more work than somebody else, and so on and so forth. And if they all get the same grade, how do you all deal with that?
And so a very good question about group structure and grades. And once again, I'd refer back to this as a reference for some of those things. In our particular case, we're not using formal groups. So they're basically getting together at the beginning of class, their group does the work, and then they're at the end of class. So we're using these informal groups. The group work that they do is actually, and we'll talk more about this later, really kind of based on did they make an effort to do the things we asked them to do. The exam is where it really counts. So they're being asked to work together to try to learn how to do these things. And if they're not pulling their weight in their group, it's going to come out on their exam grade. It was our philosophy. So that's how we dealt with it. That still means now we have to grade individual exams, right? But that's, rather than having to grade the stuff they did in class and the exam, we've reduced the amount of stuff we grade in class. And hopefully the idea is we get better results on the exam, which makes it easier to grade, essentially. Not always true. Does that help answer your question a little bit?
It does.
Yeah.
So what about the physical,
Hold on, Christy, it's all you, so.
what about the physical constraints of the classroom? Our big lecture halls really don't accommodate big group work. They're not set up like this room is.
Yes, and so in fact we're doing this, we've done this in tiered lecture halls, we've done it in probably the worst places you can do it. Let's see, yeah, so I'll go ahead and address that now. So one thing is we use groups of 3, okay? Because 3 students can sit together in pretty much any situation with the student in the middle having the resource, and they can see, the students on the 2 sides can see. Now that doesn't mean the students all choose to do that. Sometimes they're like sitting and you're like, are you guys like really working together? But yeah, that's what they're doing. But we use groups of 3, right? And so because of that, even with all the constraints, 3 people can sit and they can look at one thing in the center in common. So yeah, it's not ideal, but in fact, I don't hear many complaints from the students about this in the classroom. So it seems to work. Yeah. Oh.
So just out of curiosity, do you find that they have a tendency to always work with the same people?
The question is about how the groups form, and do they always work with the same people and not? The answer is there are some groups that always have the same people, but in fact there's a lot of diversity, especially, I'll talk a little bit about how we get students in groups, and because of the way we do it, both things happen. Some students actually always have the same group, and some students it's mixed every time. Okay. But when I talk about how we do the groups, hopefully it'll help clarify that. All right, any other questions before we? All right, so this is what we wanted them to do on the exam. So in the classroom, we figured that if they're going to be able to do that successfully on the exam, we'd have to have them doing something like this. And so what are the barriers that would keep you from having the students do something like this during class rather than what you're doing right now? Okay, so let's actually just kind of have you shout out what you think the barriers might be. So why not have your students do this in class? So right now, maybe you're doing this in class, maybe you're not. So if you're not, why aren't you having the students do this? If you are, what are the kinds of things that are problematic for having students do something like this in class?
So John, I'm actually doing something pretty similar to what
Yeah.
you're doing.
So
The students work in groups and write, I'm sorry. So I'm doing something pretty similar to what you're doing. My students work in groups, not during the lecture time. I have a separate time. And they work in groups and they write their answers together in the group. And I give them the option they can write on their own if they want. They can answer on their own if they want. But that decreases the grading. And during the classroom, one of my comments was I wanted to be able to ask explanations. And during those group meetings, we say, okay, explain your answer. We want you to know how to think that way. How, cause and effect. How do you get there? And so I have them practice it, that kind of thinking in the classroom.
Yeah. All right, so you're already doing things
Well,
like this.
I'm looking at this going, we should have figured that out together.
Very good. So, good for you. Other thoughts?
So I have my students work in groups as well, and I often have them turn in individual pages, but what I do is that I don't grade it for correctness because it's usually something that we just learned and I just want them to practice and try. So I go through and I always look at them because it gives me really great feedback about how well they're doing and how well they're understanding things. But I have 150 in my class and I just have me and one LA. So for me to cut down on grading everything, I don't grade for correctness. And then what we do is after they have time to do it, we go over it together as a class. So I ask one of the students to come up and we kind of go through it and we work through it that way. So that's how I have tried to cut down on grading.
Yep, very good.
Interesting how many groups of us have come to similar
Convergent
methods.
evolution.
Yeah.
All right, so so the barriers. And so we've kind of done this. All right. So in our case, some of the barriers that we really found, were the large class size and the large volume of grading. Right? And so one of our solutions to that was the group work. And also, if you think about these large classes, and groups, if you don't want to do formal groups so that you're not assigning the same students to the same group every time, how do you actually get the students in groups and get if you're going to grade or give any kind of feedback, how do you get that feedback to the group And our solution was to use D2L. So it turns out in D2L, you can have the students come into the classroom, form a group, whatever 3 students, and they can actually join this group in D2L from their cell phones. And now you have them in a group electronically where they can put stuff and you can give them feedback. Right? So we'll talk more about that. So that's one of the things that we found that was useful with D2L. So, so once you have the work, right, if it's just on paper, so now you have, if you have 150 or 200 students, 210 students in groups of 3, you had 70 pieces of paper, right? So if you have the students turning in paper, you got 70 pieces of paper, now what do you do with these? So we chose to have them turn it in electronically instead. And so we'll talk about how we have them do that. And now once it's turned in electronically, we can actually use D2L and the rubrics in D2L to go through and provide both feedback and scores to those groups. And the score is associated with the group, so the students automatically get their score, they automatically get their feedback in D2L. And so, so once again, trying to get, and we're using TAs to grade, we grade some of these groups, TAs grade some of these groups, and so the rubrics in D2L also help facilitate consistency in grading across different graders. And in fact, when we're doing the grading these groups, we're not as concerned about that because it's a low stakes grade. It's really mostly based on completion, and we're trying to get them some good feedback. So if there's not complete consistency, if the students are getting good feedback, it's not as big a deal as on an exam where there's high stakes and lots of points. So that is, those were some of the things we saw that we could use D2L to overcome some of these barriers. So Terry's now going to talk a little bit.
So what we're going to do at this point is, oh, sorry, do you have a question before we start? Hang on. For the recording.
Thank you for doing that.
Yes, thank you. Back again about the D2L groups. Now, I used groups when we had, I think it was Angel, and I know you said that I guess they're all getting the same feedback or grade or whatever because it's low stakes. But in Angel, you could give people in the group different grades. I've not been able to see that D2L permits that. It looks like you're in a group, everybody's got the same grade. Is that right?
Well,
or
so
maybe there's something I haven't learned.
In my experience, I always just set it up so everybody in the group got the same grade. But in fact, I know you could go into the grade book and change that. I've never done it, and you're shaking your head too.
You can go in and change it individually.
You can go in and change it individually in the grade book if you wanted to. Yeah.
Any other questions before we walk through our process? So what we'd like to do is give you a general overview of one of these modeling days and how we use D2L. And then we'll walk through specific before class, during class, and after class workflows for the professor or instructor, things that you need to do in D2L, and hopefully demystify some of those things. And then we have a link here to our detailed workflows. So if you decide that you want to do this, you can go ahead and look at the link. And you can always contact John or myself if you want to talk more about the nuts and bolts of things. So we need to give a caveat. So on, I think it's May 11th. I know that it's the Friday before
May 11th, it says
summer classes start. They're doing their annual D2L upgrade, and it's quite a big upgrade this time. So we're describing to you what we have done in D2L. We have no idea if this will all work after the upgrade, so keep that in mind. It's it's a crapshoot every time they update it, which I do my online teaching during the summer, so they always update it right before my class goes live. That's not stressful at all. Okay, so we've talked to you about this in-class learning activity a little bit. So, and we've said some of these things, I think, a couple of different times. The students form what we call organic groups. As they come into the classroom, they form a group of 3, and then once they have their group of 3, we give them their number. They can join their D2L group, and they can start their work. Then they work through the exercise provided. We've been showing you what we call our scaffold. It's a piece of paper that has little compartments for them to do different pieces of the assignment. The very first time we did this, we had this beautifully scaffolded activity, and we gave them a blank sheet of paper, and they absolutely panicked. But they do much better if they've got these little boxes to put things into. And it's actually easier for us to grade as well. So they work through their assignment, they fill everything out onto their scaffold, and there's just one page, as we've been saying, for each group. So for every 3 students, there's one page. And then the students take a picture of their model and they upload it to a Dropbox in D2L, and then we grade straight from D2L. So students need to have some sort of tech with them, but only one student per group actually needs to have something with them that can take a photograph. And we've had students that say forgot their phone, forgot their laptop. They can share the phone within their group and make sure that they can get enrolled into the group. One thing we want to note is that currently, if students are enrolling in their organic group via D2L, they want to click on the desktop version on their cell phone. It's just easier to walk through it. So we set up the groups ahead of time. The students get their number, and it's very easy for them to go in and enroll in their group. We do have sometimes students join the wrong group, so we've got a ULA walking around with a tablet that unenrolls people from groups so that they can re-enroll in the right group. And when you create groups on D2L, you can automatically create Dropboxes, so you don't have to go back and do this as a separate item. And so every group has one specific Dropbox where they can upload their final product. And then after class, as John mentioned, we evaluate the models using rubrics that we've developed. And I forget who was going to talk about this, about the 2 rubrics.
Yeah.
Probably later.
Probably
we
later,
actually
yeah.
use 2 different rubrics, which we'll tell you about. And it's so easy to copy your rubric from semester to semester, modify it a little bit, and then use it and share it with colleagues if you want to. Publishing scores to gradebook is also very easy. You save all the scores, and then it's a one-click publish of all of the grades, and then the students can access their feedback and hopefully use that feedback, constructive feedback, to improve their performance for the assessment on the exam. Yeah. Thank you. Spaced out.
So the way you're posting feedback, it requires them to do the teeny tiny right click of the teeny tiny arrow and then find the teeny tiny, this is my submission, go to the attempt, and then look at the feedback. Is that how it works? Or are they trying to look in, I guess you're doing it in through Dropbox, but do you still have problems with the students actually knowing how to navigate D2L and find feedback, even when you've told them, 10 times?
John is checking on that right now.
Well, I'm trying to see what where our slide about feedback is.
I don't know if we have it from the student view.
No.
That
actually,
is
I
an
think that we
issue,
do.
actually getting them to go in, because it's not a done deal. It's not automatically emailed to them. They have to go in and seek out that feedback.
Yeah, it is an issue. I do have a written protocol that I now send to students on how to find the feedback.
Mm-hmm.
So, yeah.
And then you can see whether or not they've accessed it, or whether or not the group has accessed the feedback. Yeah. Oh, okay. So here we're going to talk about rubrics. The rubrics are written by you. So you have different criteria and levels on each of those criteria. You make them up. They're really easy to edit and very easy to share. And as John said, it makes grading across individuals much more consistent, which we like. And then your grade is automatically put into the D2L gradebook, which I still don't like very much, but John has helped me learn how to tame my demons associated with that.
So actually, if you go back to that
Yep.
last screen, at one point in D2L, So at one point in D2L, this was a way that students could get feedback. So if they went into the grade book and they looked at their grades, if they clicked on assessment details, it would take them to the rubric, and if there was feedback that was put in there manually, it should have, or right here, it would have it would have given them the feedback. But this was actually a couple iterations of D2L ago, and I think it may have actually changed since I took these screenshots, because this does not seem like the instructions I'm now giving the students. So I do have those instructions that if you're interested, you can let me know, and I'll email you those instructions I send to the students about the feedback. It is in there, but I completely agree. D2L has not really done a good job of making it very easy for the students to see that feedback. So.
But daylight is going to solve all of our problems, right?
We're sure.
Going to be beautiful and work seamlessly. So as we've been saying, within a group, each student gets the same feedback, and the feedback is based on the radio buttons, but you also have the ability to go in and leave written feedback that is targeted to that specific group. And what we've done is we usually have a Google Doc that's open, that's shared among all the graders, because you end up saying the same thing over and over again sometimes. And so we have some canned responses that we'll put in, and then we can tailor those to individual groups as well. And John's going to...
Well, do you want to tell them about the feedback and completion rubrics?
I think you want to do that with workflow?
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
So John's going to walk you through what we do before class to set this up.
Can I make a comment, please?
Yeah.
So this is just a technical comment. I've used this for, like I said, the same class they're talking about, and now in a 400 level virology course. And one of the things I do, because I'm old and my eyes are tired, is I have them also hand in the hard copies.
Yeah,
it makes grading a little bit easier. So I still have them take the pictures and upload it. So I have a record of it, and there's no issues with that, and having them do it on time and all that sort of thing. But then for the most part, I have most of the hard copies for ease of grading.
And I confess that it's faster to do that too, to just flip through the sheets rather than opening the files.
All right, so if you wanted to do this, right, what would you have to do, right? So before class, there's some things that you need to do. So you need to, if you're starting fresh, you need to create a rubric, or if you have one from last semester, you need to import it from your other class and maybe modify it a little bit. So once again, there's a document that has, I've tried to write out very technically, step by step, you click here, do this, and you can access that. So I don't want to go through all of that. But the first thing you'd have to do is actually create the rubric. And so this is a page from D2L where you do that. In the rubric, if you go to the levels, so if you go over here to the levels and criteria, you basically can put in the different levels. One of the things that we found is by default, level 1 is 1 point, right? And so if you actually want to be able to tell the students, no, you got no credit in this category, you have to create a sort of a level 0 that's 0 points, because you cannot leave any of these rows in the rubric blank, or D2L will not automatically transfer the grades. So you actually have to put a check in each row for D2L to transfer the grades. And if you want to be able to say, no, you just didn't do this, and you got 0 for this, you have to put that in there as you're building the levels and the criteria. So basically, you build your rubric. We build 2 rubrics. So one is a completion rubric. Basically, each of those boxes in the scaffold, if the students tried to do something like we told them to do in that box, they get the check that you did this. If they only did like part of it or didn't really follow instructions, they might get 1 point instead of 2, and if they didn't put anything in there, they get 0. So this is our attempt to try to get the students to be on task and to get through the entire activity in the time allotted, right? And that's what they actually get the points for. In the end, each one of these things is worth like 1% of their grade overall in the class. So basically, for showing up and trying to do what we asked them, they get 1%, right? We create a second rubric that is the feedback for, if this was the exam, what might you have scored, right? And so most of the students are getting full credit for these, but then when you look at the feedback, we tend to be pretty harsh, because we want them to say, oh, wait, I didn't really get that, right? And it doesn't impact their grade, because this is just feedback for them. So we have a second rubric that doesn't go in the grade book, that gives them the key things that we really want them to get out of it, and whether or not they actually got those correct, or whether they're on the right track for that. So we actually create 2 rubrics. When you go in, there's one that you do, and that completion puts it the grade in the grade book. The other is purely feedback about how well they did. And then, like we mentioned before, you can also type in written feedback as well. Once you start doing that, it eats up a lot of time. So if you have a good feedback rubric, most of the things are there, and you can just click these buttons to give them feedback. That saves a lot of time as you're going through this. Yes.
Do you also provide a key, like a right answer key?
So the question is, do we also provide a key? So one of the things that I do. Oh, okay. Okay, so one of the things we do is we pull out, as we're going through, pull out 2 or 3 or 4 really good examples from the students and post those. And one of the written feedback is you really need to look at the examples. Compare your answer to the examples, right? For those students that are just, really nowhere close. So we do provide examples. And so between the feedback rubric and the examples, the students, if they want to take the time, they should be able to figure out what we were looking for on these, what they should have done on these activities.
So with these 2 rubrics that you're using, I don't suppose it's feasible to automate giving them the feedback on the feedback rubric and then having that automatically translate into the points rubric.
So the question is, could we streamline this and so somehow have the feedback rubric just have one rubric and the feedback would automatically transfer into. So I've thought a little bit about that. And so for example, if you set up the feedback rubric so that every column was worth 1 point, and as long as they got one, the lowest thing in that was you did something, right? Then you could essentially do one rubric. So really with the completion rubric, when you pull up the document, you can kind of look at it and go click, 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 click down through that. So it doesn't take much time to have these 2 separate rubrics. And so I have never pursued just trying to combine it into one rubric because it seemed to me like it was more work than it was worth for me. But it's something you could certainly think about, is trying to combine it into one rubric so that if they did anything, they get the score that counts toward their grade, and other stuff doesn't actually affect their grade in that rubric. It might be possible.
And what we hope is that they look at the difference between the 2 scores, between completion and actual assessment of their work, and they take note of that and work hard to change their study habits for the exam.
How do those appear to them? Are they both linked to the same Dropbox grade?
Yeah, so essentially when they're in there looking at their feedback, they're just, the 2 rubrics are stacked on top of each other. So the first one they see is a completion, and they scroll down and they see the feedback, and then they see the comments. So it just, if you could imagine scrolling this, there would be different, above this would be the completion rubric, and this would be the feedback rubric. So. All right, and so here you can just see a screen where you can actually see we have a structure function completion rubric, a structure function feedback rubric, and to edit these things you have to do the little arrow in the pop-up box, which if you use D2L much, you know this. If you've never used D2L, it's really confusing that these menus come from these little arrows on the side. So just a little technical note there. All right, so the next thing after you've created or imported your rubric is you create your groups. So once again, technically, the way to do this is all in the document, but you have to set up the groups, and you want to set up groups. The enrollment type is need a number of groups with a capacity number. So basically, you're going to say if you have 210 students and you want groups of 3, you'd need at least 70 groups. I always make a couple extra because in the end you might have a couple groups of 2 depending how the students come in. And you want maximum enrollment to be 3, right? And so you would put in those number of users, number of groups. So number of users in our case would be 3, number of groups would be 70, and then you create or you save. You also want to link a Dropbox to this. So down here at the bottom, there's a little checkbox. It says set up Dropbox folders. So you're going to choose to set up the Dropbox. And then as part of setting up the Dropbox, you're going to be able to choose to add a grade item. And so you can, if you've already set up the grade item, you can go link to that, or you can choose to create a new grade item right from in here. And so you've linked that, and then you link the rubric to the grade item and Dropbox. Actually, I found out you just want to link it to the Dropbox, not the grade item, because anyhow, you just want to link it to the Dropbox. You don't want to actually link it to the grade item. And so you go and you choose your Dropbox, you link it to the, you choose the rubric and you link it to the Dropbox, and at that point, you're done in D2L. Okay? Now, this sounds really complicated, and when you first look at it, it's like the first few times through it is a little complicated. There was a time where I forgot to do this before lecture, and I showed up at lecture, we're passing out the handouts, and I realized I didn't set all this up. And I managed to do it in like 3 minutes at the beginning of class. So once you've got it down, it actually flows pretty well. So it's not, there's a little learning curve, but once you figure out where everything is, it doesn't take that long to set this up. Now the other thing that has to happen here is you've got all these organic groups forming, and they can't just randomly decide which group to join, otherwise it becomes a mess. So the groups have to know, we are group 1, this group is group 2, this group is group 3. So the way that we've dealt with that is on the instructions, we put their group number. And so you can imagine you could have a ULA go through and say, okay, this is going to be group 1, and just physically write, but we chose to use mail merge in Word. So we basically created a spreadsheet. We've gone back and forth, but now we currently give an instruction, a sheet to every member of the group, so there needs to be 3 instruction sheets that all say group 1. Right? So we created a spreadsheet that basically says 111, 222, 333, 4. So then we go through, use mail merge in Word, and it basically generates 210 documents. The first 3 say group 1, the next 3 say group 2, the next 3 say group 3, and so on. And then when the ULAs are passing them out, they just pass them out in groups of 3. Now I must say, if you're in a class of 210 students by yourself, you probably ain't going to be able to do this. You do need some undergrad support to do this, right? You have to create these instructions and then send them to a copier or a printer so that you now have 210 sheets of paper with the instructions and these group numbers on the individual instruction sheets. So you have to do that before class as well. All right, so I think Terry's going to tell us what happens during class.
Right. So as we've mentioned, we use these organic groups. We've found that in these tiered lecture halls that we've been using, this is a better strategy for us. If you end up with a student that is in a static group and 2 of their 3 group members aren't there for the day and they're doing this group work, it can be really difficult for them. So we do organic groups. We do have the motivated students that come in and they know who they want to sit with, and so they get there early and they have their group of 3. Once they have their group of 3, then they are able to receive the instructions, and they can't have the instructions until they have their group of 3. So they're highly motivated to form their groups so that they can get started working. And John has already walked through these mail merge. They each have their group number right up here, so they know which group to join. And then they merely go into our D2L course, find the topic for the day, and they self-enroll themselves into the groups. Now, in our classes, this first modeling day tends to be a little bit chaotic, and getting the students to do this, to come in, to find a group of 3, to get their handout, and to get into their group can take quite a bit of time when all we want to do is get to the subject and get them thinking about the science. So I think that the next time that I do this, I will have this activity on a separate day so that they can learn how to do this on a different day when they're not having to do the modeling exercise. And then for the first modeling exercise, they come in and they know how to do this, because this can take quite a bit of time if they're not sure what's going on.
And so one comment there as well is, if you have ULAs who have either been students in the class or been ULAs before, it makes a huge difference, because the ULAs know how to do this, they know how to manage the groups. I basically have experienced ULAs for the last couple semesters, and I basically don't even worry about the groups. The ULAs are taking care of it.
Right.
So it's a really good resource if you have that luxury.
So what this looks like with an experienced team is you've got the instructor or the co-instructors sort of managing, making sure that you have formed your groups and done your Dropboxes, which I often forget to do and do right before class starts. And then you've got your instructional team out and handing out these handouts to the students that are forming their group of 3. So we've had between 3 and 5 individuals just spread out in the lecture hall, and they each have a pile of these handouts. And I would say we can get it done in
5 minutes.
5 minutes, and especially if the students are coming to class early that day.
And I start class right at time. I don't even spend time during class with the groups. Maybe the first one we get 5 minutes in before we start. But I start, there's students that are working before class starts, because as soon as they're in the group, they can start working. So we really don't eat very much class time getting these students in their groups and joining the groups. So.
Which is great, because they need to do the work before they leave. They're not allowed to take the photograph after class and then upload it. They have to do the work in the 80 minutes and then take the photograph and upload their work, which they all know how to do. They know how to use their camera phones. That's pretty easy. Dropbox is really easy to navigate. John and I have not had trouble with Wi-Fi load in any of the classrooms that we have dealt with. We have heard some problems with other instructors, but it's been pretty easy for us. So this goes back to Corey's comment about old eyes and reading the sheets. So you can get photographs like this that you would then have to grade, and for completion grading, that's not that big of a deal, but to go through and actually provide constructive criticism on the 7 different elements within this model, that can be a pretty big strain on your eyes. And you're, oh no, you don't need that.
All right, and so just to kind of touch back to what Terri said about, and this has been brought up before, I have not had the students turn in these papers because I don't want to have to deal with the papers. But in fact, other groups, and Michaela's done this, have decided that it's easier to have the students turn in the paper and then actually have the TAs or ULAs with the paper, put the students in groups, and not have photos uploaded. So all you have is the paper, and they've kind of done a hybrid system. So I would say there's lots of flexibility here in your particular situation. You don't have to do all of this. You can pull parts of it out and do it. So in terms of actually the grading, it's a really good point. It's actually much faster to flip through a bunch of paper than it is to download these images. D2L is actually not very good about this. You have to go to the next group, you have to click on a link, and then you get the place where you can open the image. Now, I do this with multiple screens. So I have D2L open on one screen, I download the image and it pops up on my other screen. I can rotate it, I can zoom, I can do whatever. So I have the rubric open and I have the image open, and that works really well. For TAs or who are using their laptops in many cases, that's not the case, and now you have the image over top of the rubric and it's much more difficult. And so I can see a huge advantage to having paper images as well, right? And so if you put the paper images in the order of the groups in D2L, which does this weird thing where group 3 is like mixed in with group 30 because it doesn't actually sort numerically. But anyhow, you could use the paper to actually do the grading. Now, one thing about if the students are not uploading images, they don't actually have a record of that for them to look at and go back to. So one of the nice things about having them upload the image is once it's there, anybody in the group can go access that image and see it at any point in the future and when they're looking at their feedback. So there's lots of different ways around that, but if you're not having them upload an image, you may want to think about having them take the picture themselves or some other way to capture that image for feedback. So once you've gone through, you've done the evaluation with the rubrics, you put in any feedback you want, you can do this without the students actually seeing the feedback yet. Although the caveat there is I have had times when I know I have not yet published it, and somehow in D2L the students have managed to see part of that feedback. So I don't quite understand. There's so many little tunnels and nuances in D2L. So I would not swear that they cannot see the feedback, because I think somehow they see part of that feedback before I've published it. So
some things are different when they're accessing via cell phone versus from a computer.
Yes,
they can see
so
things that you've tried to block for them.
One of the things daylight is supposed to remedy.
Supposedly.
So anyhow, But if you do not publish it, most of the students will not be able to see it. So one of the things you need to do is go through and publish. Basically, that's going to involve going into the Dropbox, checking a little button. And once again, now if you had more than 200 groups, this is one of those things about D2L, you have to do this twice because it'll only list 200 at a time. But most of the time with groups, we have much fewer than 200, right? So we only have to do it once. You check the little box and you tell it to publish, and then when it does that, it automatically puts the scores into D2L, into the grade book, and it also gives the students their feedback. Now, one of the things that I do to make sure that everything worked is I go to the grade book and I actually look in the grade book for icons where there's a Dropbox submission where there's no grade. Because sometimes if you didn't click things right, the grade didn't get transferred, and then it didn't get transferred from the rubric to the Dropbox, and then it didn't transfer the grade. So it's just a way of verifying. And that's a screen where you could actually go in and you could say, well, this student in this group only gets a different grade than the other student. So you could modify individual grades in that screen. Right? And so then once you do that, you're done. The other thing I do, as I mentioned before, is I pull out some good examples and I post those elsewhere in D2L so the students can see those. And at that point, we're done with that particular instructional activity. So what do we have next? So I guess we wanted to leave plenty of time based on what we saw at Tammy's for people to talk about their own ideas and things they're doing and kind of ask questions about what we did. So we're actually done a little early. So we'd be happy to answer questions. We'd happy to have discussion about what you're doing, your ideas, things like that.
I have a question, a couple of questions. One is, I know you said the groups were informal and they self-select.
Mm-hmm.
So one question is there issue with students who don't know other students in the class or who maybe are of different ethnic and racial groups and feel somewhat, odd already? Is that an issue? And then the other thing is...
So can I answer that first?
Yes.
And then because I'll forget the question, right? So the question is about group composition with informal groups. And it's an excellent question. And it's tricky with formal groups too. And so what we've essentially done is, in a way, stuck our head in the sand and ignored this. So the way it works is students come in, and the students, if they have 3 students and they want to be together, and there's 2 students sitting there, the ULA walks up and says, do you have a third group member? And they say, yes, but we're waiting for them. The ULA says, okay, fine. When you have your third member, we'll give you the instructions. Okay? And so they're texting their friends going, you better get here soon, right? So those are groups that know who they want to be with, right? So you also have instances where there's a student sitting by themselves. And so the ULA walks up to the students and says, do you have a group? And the student says, no. And so then the ULA looks over there and sees the student and says, do you have a group? No, okay, you 2 are together, we're going to find you a third person. Next person walks in the room, they say, do you have a group? And if the person says yes, fine. If they say no, you cram those 3 together. And so there's no real thought about the composition of the group, but everybody gets in a group, and if they know no one, the ULAs are forcing them into groups of 3. That's where the experienced ULAs really pay off because they know this. The other trick is at the very end, at the start of class, you don't want to have all groups of 3. You want to have a few groups with 2 in it because you know there's going to be those people that walk in by themselves 5 minutes late, and what are you going to do with them? You're going to stick them in one of those groups of 2. Right? Or if you're 2 people walking together, you form a new group of 2 and then add a third person to them. So we kind of ignore the whole group composition. I mean, I know there's a lot in the resource I said at the beginning, male-female ratio, underrepresented minorities. There's all kinds of that we've kind of stuck our head in the sand and ignored.
But did you say you don't get the instructions unless there's 3?
That's right, until there's 3. Well, there at the end, when there's groups of 2, we will give them instructions, right? But until you got a group of 3, you don't get the instructions.
Okay. So. And then the other question is, do students, I think I heard you say, that something about they may work for 80 minutes. Did I hear that? So do students ever say on your evaluations at the end, the instructors didn't do the teaching, we had to do it ourselves? Is that ever a criticism,
I do get that feedback, but it's not just because of what we do on these days. Yes, so we do see students. And when I look at my SEERs, I mean, you've all seen the comments on the SEERs. So overall, the number of mentions of modeling or these activities is pretty high, and it's much higher in the positive category than the negative category. So, so I've managed to somehow make so the students see this as a positive, not a negative. I can see it going the other way as well. Yeah, there was something else about the groups, but it went away.
So we really impress upon them that this is how science works, that, you know, as a scientist, you're not working in a vacuum, you're collaborating with other people, and you're reading other people's research, and so we impress upon them that this is a scientific practice, being able to work in groups with people you don't necessarily know. So they know that we're very serious about it from the outset.
Okay. Oh, and the other thing I wanted to mention about the 80 minutes, okay? So the way this works is it's not like they get their thing and then they're working in their groups for 80 minutes without interruption, okay? So these are pretty complex activities, and there are lots of groups that will get stuck and hung up, right? So what we do, and we're walking, we're not just standing up there at the top, front talking to each other about, the weather or sports. We're walking around actively poking groups and saying, how's it going? We're kind of looking at what's on their scaffold and saying, if they're not moving along, we're trying to poke them and move them along. But then we typically have 2 or 3 points where we know it's going to be good to have a report out, right? And so there's a number of different ways we've played with this. One is to try to find the groups that are really on track and then have a good explanation at that point and kind of convince them that they want to present, right? And so part of the argument there is, okay, you know what employers want, right? They want people with presentation skills. Well, here's a chance for you to practice presenting, right? So, and you coach them through and they give them a little confidence, and you can get groups to come up and present. The other thing is the random number generator. There's groups out there, they all have a number. You pull up the random number generator on the screen and say, who goes next, right? And then in that case, you're encouraging them that this is not just about the right answer. This is about what you don't understand. So tell us where you got to and tell us what you don't understand so we can figure it out and move on. Because there's other groups that are having the same problem you are. So I've used both of those approaches. And so what that does is there's checkpoints where if students are stuck, all of a sudden they get a discussion about what should be in that part of the scaffold so that then they can move on to the next part of the scaffold. And then at the very end, we try to have time to kind of have a group or two report out on the complete model and try to touch on those big ideas that are really important that we wanted them to get out of the activity before everybody takes off and leaves. The activities are complex enough that the really good groups, they can spend a lot of time talking. And if you see a group that's like really cruising through, you come up and you start poking at them and giving them some complexities that they hadn't thought about. And then they have to think about that a little bit more. The groups that are really struggling, you're just trying to get them to the basics so they can kind of move on to the next thing. It takes a little bit of skill to kind of manage this so that 2/3 of the groups aren't done and the other ones are just starting, right?
The random number generator is a great motivator. If they know that they might be called to the front of the room to talk about Part B, they really want to get Part B done.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, taking off from that last point a bit, because I was thinking about interactivity. Have you ever, with your checkpoints, have you ever experimented with using those to stage the questions? Say, have a first round where people are trying to say, okay, what sort of experiments would you run to check this model? And then at a checkpoint, give them some experimental results and go from there. I'm wondering if you've ever played with that and how it's gone.
So let me try to mirror back what you said. So and essentially, the instructions are incomplete, so that they don't really have what they need to move on until they've gotten this checkpoint and you've talked about it and given them the next thing. I have not played with that. It's a very interesting idea, and with the idea, we've said one of the things that we don't think we do very well is getting them to think about evidence and using data. And so I can see how that could work. I've never tried it, so. Yeah.
We do use clickers sometimes at the checkpoints, so that would be a good way to build that in.
Yeah, so, yeah.
Yes, I'd like you to address the question of security. So anytime you use D2L, anything can be captured off a computer screen. So if you have the intention of using these year after year, granted they're low stakes assessments, but a group could easily come in with last year's rubric and just run with it.
Absolutely, so there are times, and every year we modify these things a little bit based on what happened the last time. And there's been a couple times where I'm like, that is completely from last year's instructions, right?
And we used
in
a
some
different
cases-
paper.
In some cases, it's students who have repeated the class, they failed it and they came back, and they have their last year's model with them, right? That was wrong. So in fact, I've taken the stance that I don't really care. It's a completion rubric, right? Basically, if they came and they tried to do it, they're going to get full credit. So really what they're doing is hurting themselves, or maybe not. Maybe using somebody else's thing from last year that somebody gave them is actually helpful to them. Maybe that's, so I've chosen to not worry about that, essentially. The exam is what counts. Whatever route they can get to figure it out for the exam, to me, is what I care about. So.
I'll ask a related follow-up question. Because these are basically completion rubrics and you get a grade for making a good faith effort, everyone's above average. So it dilutes the value or essentially it exaggerates the value of other assessments which are not essentially some formative or completion
So this is
assessments.
4% of their overall grade. 4% of their overall grade. So at least in our classes, in many cases at the end, we're kind of curving the grades anyways, right? Mm-hmm. So if you're adding 4% on, that's a little bit less of a curve that you wind up putting on the grade. So that's my approach to it. You're right. Yeah. But yeah.
Just to the beginning part, thanks for taking this over. So one of the things about most of these models is you can easily change them such that it wouldn't be, that you would catch that immediately and then that could be addressed. If you're doing something with the genetic code, you just change the sequence a little bit, or you change the amino acid or the protein being used. It's essentially the same. It doesn't take that much time to change it that much, and then you will notice the difference between that and others.
So, John, does that mean that you basically do about 4 of these a year? Because you were saying I think each was worth about 1% or so.
Well, so if you do 5 and you drop the lowest one, because then you don't have to deal with, my grandma died, or I had to be at a ball game or whatever, right? So if you do 5, you drop 1, and then each one's 1%. Or if you do 6 and you drop 1, then each one is worth 0.8 or whatever it would come out to. Yeah, so just very low stakes, but enough that and in a way, you could put no points on this if you wanted to. I don't know exactly how that would change what happens. I predict if you put no points, you'd have fewer students showing up. But in the end, you have to link this very directly to the exams. So what they do on this is very directly connected to the exam, right? So if they do this, hopefully they can, if they just did it and really understood it, they would get a really good grade. If they did it, but there's parts they didn't understand, they could still do well. If they don't do it, it's going to be, they could still, if they learned everything else, they could come in and they could do well on the exam. But this really sets them up to be able to do well on that assessment on the exam. And so to me, that's the key thing, is you're tightly linking this to what they do on the exam. And when they come in and are like, I didn't do well on my exam, you say, okay, let's pull up your model, and let's look at the model, let's look at the feedback, and let's look at what you did on the exam. Oh, well, on your model, you were missing this, and we told you were missing this. And look, the exam asked you about it, and you had a big blank spot, right? So I think that can be the real motivator to try to get them to do this. The points are, I don't know, insignificant.
And you can also point out that they never access the feedback
In
on
some
the model
cases,
at
the
that
students
time.
never access the feedback, yes, and you can point that out.
How close are the test questions to the model?
So the question is, how close are the test questions to the model? And so one of the things that Corey pointed out is, if these are really good, in our case, like in many of these cases for us, these are processes or phenomena that you can easily change a part of it. And now, if you know how to do it, you can get to the answer. If you just memorize the old answer off of the activity, it gets you nothing, essentially, right? And and what we also do is, so what I try to do is I try to set these up. And now if you go through and look at my exams, you'll say he doesn't really do that, but I try. Is I try to set it up so that a lot of it is kind of almost the same thing they did on the model. But then now you have to now something changes or something breaks that we didn't specifically do in the model, but if you really understood the model, you can predict now what would happen. So what do you think is going to happen when we change this thing about this process or about this, about the mechanism? If this thing changes, can you tell me now what's going to happen? And that means that students really have to have understood the underlying mechanisms in this model to be able to answer the question get full credit for that question on the exam. So some of it's pretty similar, but I try to make a place where they really had to understand it. They can't just regurgitate what they wrote on the model, essentially. And you do see when you're grading, you'll see, okay, now there's this thing we said in class during the feedback, and you'll just see students just writing that down, right? And you're like, yeah, but this is a different context, and you didn't contextualize it. You're not going to get full credit for just parroting back those words, essentially. So does that...
I've done something like this in a physics class, although not with D2L. So here's my question. Do you find that attendance is more during the modeling sessions or during the lecture sessions?
Okay. So the question is about attendance in lecture versus modeling. So in our lecture sessions, we have clickers, which are also a low stakes assessment worth. Over the course of the semester, the modeling and the clickers are probably worth about the same percentage of their grade. And we don't see much difference between regular lecture days and modeling days. And I would say our typical attendance is 75 to 80% probably, based on the number of clickers. It depends on the day and where you are in the semester, but yeah. So I've not noticed a large difference between the two different days.
Just a follow-up question. So do the students know ahead of time when they've got the modeling? Because there's something they have to do, right?
It's
to
on the
prepare for
syllabus.
it?
So
Okay.
the first day when they walk in and look at the syllabus, it denotes those days. So.
Any other questions?
So more as a teacher creature comfort, have you attempted to use any image straightening apps or anything like that before they submit their program, like a Office Lens, or is that just adding too many layers of technology?
So the fact is 99.9% of the images are great. You can zoom in and you can actually get down to more detail than you could on a piece of paper, essentially. So I have not bothered with any kind of, and so one of the things on the completion rubric is the image readable and all there, right? And so it gives them a little bit of incentive to make sure they gave you an image that you can actually evaluate. But it's a very small number that are bad images.
So is still the majority of the points coming from this course exam-based then?
80% of the points from the course aren't on the exams.
So you have these 4 to 5 things to grade here and then several exams, and is that pretty much the bulk of it for the class?
Yeah, so the other points come from things like active learning with the clickers during class, clicker quizzes, online homework, and so all of that stuff is pretty much automated. So the bulk of the grading we do are the evaluation of the models and then the actual grading of the exams, which just, if you're doing it individually, it just takes time. If you didn't have support, if you're trying to do it all by yourself with no TAs or you don't want the TAs grading, yeah, it would be very, very difficult to do. Yeah. So we could not have done this, once again, we could not have done this without some of the changes that happened because of the biology initiative and some of the resources we got in terms of TAs and ULAs to go along with this. If you are by yourself in a class of 250 people, trying to do this, I would say, is going to be a real challenge, right? But even if you just have a few ULAs, you could do this type of thing. The grading on the exams becomes more difficult without people who can actually grade these type of things. So.
I'll hurry, Adele. You could still have the same activities and then post a sample, the perfect answer. not grade them, and so then you've decreased your workload dramatically.
Right. So
Yeah.
the like I said, I think you can use lots of different pieces of this. So one
Right.
thing you could do is you could have the students do this, but not do the rubrics, not do the feedback, and just go flip through a number of these, pull out a couple good answers, and post them maybe with a little bit of commentary, and use that. Right. You could absolutely do that. And the truth is, like Terry said, oftentimes we know the students don't even look at the feedback. So sometimes I'm thinking to myself, why am I doing this, right? Because the students, but that's not all the students. There are students who are looking at the feedback and who are getting value from it. So it's a cost-benefit analysis. You have to do that calculus yourself. Yeah.
And one thing that I've been thinking about is throughout the course of the semester, changing the percentage, the weighted percentage of the completion versus the evaluation rubric. So the first one, they get all their credits from the completion rubric. The second one, most of the credit comes from completion, a little bit from the evaluation, and then just keep increasing that all throughout the semester.
I think Mark has one more, and then we'll wrap things up here.
Right, just to sort of follow up on Adele's question, if you generally, my experience has been, if you give students a rubric and tell them to look at their own work with the rubric, they way overinflate what they think they've done. So it's not a good learning experience. But you can also flip that and have them do peer reviewing. You can have them using the rubric to grade the other students' work for formative feedback. And my experience has been that with that the students learn more from doing that they can apply to their own work in the future.
So if you would please join me in thanking John and Terry for a great session.